Have you ever found yourself scrolling through your phone at midnight, staring at someone else's perfect life? Their flawless skin, their exotic vacations, their career milestones that seem to fall into place like pieces of a puzzle, while you're lying there wondering, what am I even doing with my life? It's an unsettling ache, isn't it? A quiet voice in the back of your mind whispering, you should be more like them. And just like that, comparison wraps its cold, invisible fingers around your heart. The truth is, every one of us, no matter how successful, wise, or self-assured, has been caught in this trap. Some of us compare our looks, some our wealth, some our relationships, and others our achievements. It's a game no one admits they're playing, yet nearly everyone is. But have you ever stopped to wonder, why do we do this? Long before social media turned our lives into highlight reels, humans were already comparing. The farmer would glance at his neighbor's harvest. The villager would admire another's silk garments. The warrior would measure his strength against the mightiest in the land. It's a story as old as time. Modern psychology calls it social comparison theory, a natural tendency where we evaluate ourselves based on how we stack up against others. It's how we gauge success, value, and belonging. A survival instinct, some might say. But what began as a tool for social awareness has mutated into a silent war within our minds. And no one tells this better than ancient Buddhist teachings. In Buddhism, this impulse is born from two ancient forces: attachment and ego. The attachment to the idea of who we think we should be, and the ego that desperately craves to feel superior or validated. The Buddha called it tanha, a thirst, an insatiable craving not just for material things, but for identity, for status, for affirmation. And with it comes this vimana, the conceit of I am, the constant self-referencing mind that needs to know, am I better? Am I worse? Am I enough? We don't realize it, but every time we measure ourselves against others, we chain our happiness to something outside ourselves. We build a prison made of other people's lives, and then wonder why it feels so suffocating. It's like a man standing knee-deep in a river, dying of thirst, while the water flows around him. He doesn't see that what he seeks has been within his reach all along. There's an old Zen story about a man who spends his life searching for a priceless jewel. He travels from town to town, from mountaintop to monastery, asking sages and merchants where he might find this gem that would make him truly happy. After decades, weary and broken, he meets a kind old monk. The monk smiles and gestures for him to feel under the collar of his own robe. And there it is. The jewel had been sewn into his garment the entire time. We chase after the images of others, convinced that if we could just be like them, we would finally be content. But in doing so, we overlook the infinite worth within ourselves. Comparison is the thief of joy not because it shows us others' successes, but because it blinds us to our own. It distracts us from the silent, miraculous unfolding of our unique path. And worse, it seeds two toxic emotions in the heart, envy and pride. When we perceive others as above us, envy festers. When we think ourselves above others, pride swells. Both are poison disguised as perspective. The Buddha warned of this dual trap, teaching that superiority, inferiority, and even equality are illusions when clung to with attachment. They all bind the mind in cycles of craving and dissatisfaction. So why do we keep comparing? Because the ego loves to keep score. It thrives in the arena of winners and losers. It fears irrelevance more than death. And so it whispers again and again, look at them, look at you. But here's the truth most people miss. There is no them. There's only you standing alone in your experience. You carrying your joys and sorrows. You walking a path no other soul has ever tread nor ever will. And yet the habit of comparison clings tightly, doesn't it? It hides in small moments, a glance at someone's car, the number of likes on a post, a friend's promotion, a stranger's beauty. Each tiny moment adding weight to an invisible burden we were never meant to carry. What would it feel like to finally set it down? To wake up one morning and no longer measure your worth by the life someone else is living. To walk into a room, a street, a conversation, not with the anxious need to measure up, but with the peaceful confidence of simply being. To see another's light not as a threat to your own, but as proof that we all have a fire within us, and the universe is vast enough for us all to shine. This isn't fantasy, it's a choice, a practice, a liberation waiting quietly at the edges of your awareness. And perhaps you've already felt it. In those rare, fleeting moments when you were fully immersed in your own life, laughing with a friend, lost in a sunset, creating something beautiful, and for once you weren't comparing, you were just being. Those moments are not accidents. They are reminders. Reminders that beyond this endless cycle of measuring and chasing, there exists a peace no one can give or take from you. A peace born not of becoming more like someone else, but of becoming more fully yourself. And if the mind has trapped itself in this war of comparisons for so long, the natural question follows. Is there a way out? Stay with me. We often tell ourselves, a little comparison never hurt anyone. After all, isn't it what pushes us to be better, to aim higher, to improve ourselves? That's what we've been taught in schools, in boardrooms, even within our families. The idea that by measuring ourselves against others, we'll somehow become more. But here's the part no one tells you. Every act of comparison comes with a hidden cost, and it's steeper than you think. Not the kind of cost you'll find on a receipt or something you can measure in dollars or likes. No, this price is paid in fragments of your peace, in the erosion of your self-worth, in the quiet, invisible toll it takes on your spirit. And perhaps the most dangerous part is that it feels so normal. It begins in small, innocent moments. A glance at a friend's new car, an acquaintance's flawless vacation photos, a stranger's seemingly perfect relationship. And without realizing it, you start writing silent equations in your mind. Their success equals my failure. Their happiness equals my lacking. Their beauty equals my flaw. Comparison, you see, doesn't merely observe, it judges. It places one above and one below. And in doing so, it slowly reshapes the way you see the world and your place in it. Buddhist wisdom has long warned of this poison. The Buddha spoke of moha, delusion, the clouded lens through which we perceive reality. And one of the greatest delusions is believing that the value of your life can be determined by someone else's. When you compare, you no longer see things as they are. You see them as better or worse, more or less, worthy or unworthy. And that's where the suffering begins. It's not just an emotional toll, it affects your mental clarity, your relationships, your creativity. Have you noticed how comparison shrinks your world? How it takes your infinite potential and squeezes it into a narrow corridor of other people's standards? You stop pursuing what truly moves your soul. You start chasing what impresses others. The artist who stops painting what she loves because another's style gets more praise. The young man who abandons his passion for teaching because his friends are earning 6 figures in tech. The mother who feels less than because other parents seem to have it all together. Comparison robs you of your authentic path. And here's the cruel irony. Even when you win the game of comparison, you still lose, because it's never enough. There will always be someone richer, fitter, younger, wiser. The Buddha called this the endless wheel of craving, tanha. Like drinking salty water to quench your thirst, the more you compare, the more dissatisfied you become. And slowly it plants 2 seeds in your heart, envy and self-doubt. Envy whispers, why them, not me? Self-doubt asks, am I even good enough? Left unchecked, these emotions ferment into bitterness and disconnection, not just from others but from yourself. Your mind becomes a restless wanderer, constantly scanning for threats to your worth, for lives to envy, for people to silently compete with. And worst of all, it steals the present moment. When you're consumed by comparison, you miss what's right in front of you. The warmth of the morning sun on your skin, the sound of your child's laugh, the quiet contentment of a job well done, even if no one claps. You become so focused on how your life measures up that you forget to live it. And what is the point of all this? if not to fully experience the fragile, fleeting beauty of existence. There's a Zen saying, "When you chase two rabbits, you catch none." When your attention is divided between living your own life and measuring someone else's, you lose both. But the good news is this: the same mind that learned to compare can learn to stop. It begins with awareness, noticing those moments when your heart tightens as you scroll, when your mood drops after a conversation, when envy flickers like a shadow behind your thoughts. And in those moments, instead of following the thread of comparison, you pause, you breathe, you return to yourself. You remember that no two lives can ever truly be compared, not when every heart carries different wounds, different joys, different unseen battles. You remember that your worth was never meant to be measured. It was meant to be lived. And perhaps in those quiet moments, you'll start to sense the cost of comparison isn't one you're willing to keep paying. Because when you let go of this need to measure up, you don't fall behind. You come home to yourself. And with that awareness, a question begins to form. If comparison has stolen so much peace from your life, what would it feel like to reclaim it? Stay with me, because the answer is simpler and more beautiful than you might imagine. So we've seen how comparison quietly siphons away our peace, but if you trace its path even deeper, you'll find it isn't the problem itself. It's a symptom, a surface ripple on a much deeper ocean. Because beneath every moment of envy, every pang of insecurity, and every whispered, "Why not me?" there's a root system, a tangled, ancient network of beliefs that keeps comparison alive. And if we're truly going to be free, we have to go there, to the root of it all. The Buddha taught that suffering arises not from the world itself, but from how we cling to it. And comparison is one of the subtlest forms of clinging. Clinging to identity, to worth, to the illusion of permanence in a world that is forever changing. At the heart of this clinging lies the ego. Now, let's be clear. In Buddhism, ego isn't just arrogance or pride. It's the mistaken belief that you are a fixed, independent, separate self. A me who must be better than them. A me who exists in constant need of validation. This is what creates the hunger for comparison in the first place. The ego tells you, your worth depends on how you stack up. And so you chase achievements, beauty, approval, never realizing you're trapped in a cage you built yourself. But it gets trickier because ego doesn't work alone. It's fed by attachment, our tendency to grasp at things, ideas, roles, and identities as if they could save us. We get attached to the idea of being successful, to being admired, to being better than average. And when someone else threatens those attachments, by having what we want or being what we wish we were, comparison strikes. It's a reflex, a desperate attempt by the ego to protect its fragile sense of self. But here's the truth the Buddha realized under the Bodhi tree. Everything you're clinging to is impermanent. Your looks, your status, your victories, even your failures. They are passing clouds in the vast sky of awareness. And yet we suffer because we forget this. We believe the clouds are the sky itself, and in doing so, we fall for illusion. Maya, as ancient Buddhist texts call it, is the great illusion of permanence and separateness. It convinces us that life is a competition, that happiness is scarce, and that we must constantly compare to survive. But in reality, none of it is fixed. The person you envy today may face heartbreak tomorrow. The life you idealize may be crumbling behind the scenes, and the self you're so desperate to defend was never as solid as you believed. Here's the quiet, liberating secret. When you see through the illusion, the need to compare begins to dissolve. Not because you force yourself to stop, not because you convince yourself you're better, but because you realize there's nothing to protect. There is no fixed you and no fixed them. Just ever-changing, interconnected streams of experience. This doesn't mean you won't notice beauty or achievement in others. It means you'll stop making it about your own worth. You'll begin to celebrate without envy, to admire without craving, to witness without clinging. It's like waking from a dream you didn't know you were having. And in that waking moment, you start asking different questions. Not why don't I have what they have, but who is this I that believes it needs more? Not how can I be better than them, but what if there's no better, only different expressions of the same boundless life? This is the beginning of wisdom, not in an abstract, intellectual way, but in the lived, felt experience of freedom. The moment you catch yourself in comparison and smile, recognizing the old habit for what it is. The moment you feel envy rise and choose instead to wish that person well. The moment you realize the only thing keeping you from peace was a belief you never needed to hold. And like that, you start cutting the root. One comparison at a time, one attachment at a time, one illusion at a time. It's not easy, it won't happen overnight, but it's possible, and it begins now. Because when you stop chasing a self that was never solid to begin with, what you find isn't emptiness. It's clarity, stillness, an unshakable sense of enough. And perhaps you're wondering, if ego and attachment feed comparison, what can nourish peace instead? That's where we'll go next. And what you'll discover might just change the way you see yourself forever. It wasn't always this way. There was a time, long before glowing screens and endless scrolls, when our world was measured by seasons, by harvests, by the simple rhythms of dawn and dusk. But now, modern life hums at a fever pitch. We are constantly connected, yet increasingly alone, endlessly informed but rarely wise. And it's no accident that in this world of noise, comparison has become a constant shadow. Because the very structure of modern life is designed to keep us chasing. Think about it. Every scroll, every post, every carefully curated snapshot of someone else's highlight reel is a silent invitation to measure yourself. Their vacation, their new home, their perfect relationship. You don't see their loneliness. You don't see the fights behind the smiles, the doubts behind the achievements. You see the mask. And then you compare it to your unfiltered, messy, beautifully imperfect life. This is the mind trap of modern life, a system that monetizes your attention by feeding your insecurity. Social media wasn't built to connect us. It was built to consume us, to turn your self-worth into a performance, to measure your value in likes, followers, and fleeting digital applause. And we fell for it, not because we're weak, but because the human mind is wired for survival, constantly scanning for threats, for status, for belonging. In the ancient world, that instinct kept us alive. In today's world, it keeps us trapped in loops of endless comparison, trapped in the illusion that happiness is out there, just beyond the next achievement, the next purchase, the next upgrade. But here's what the Buddha realized, and what so many of us have forgotten. Peace isn't found by adding more. It's uncovered by letting go. Modern life whispers more. But the Dharma gently asks, what if you already have enough? There's a reason so many monks, sages, and wanderers have chosen simplicity. Not because simplicity is moral, but because simplicity is freedom. The more you own, the more you fear losing. The higher you climb, the more fragile your position becomes. The more faces you wear, the harder it is to remember your own. Modern life traps us in the pursuit of identities. The successful one, the beautiful one, the wise one, the one who finally figured it out. But every identity is a prison when you mistake it for who you truly are. And so we compare. Not because we're vain, but because we've been conditioned to believe our worth depends on winning this invisible game. But what if you could step off the playing field entirely? What if you could stop chasing and start witnessing? There's a Zen story of a monk who asked his master, "How can I escape the wheel of suffering?" The master simply replied, "Who bound you to it?" It's a question worth asking. Who told you you had to be better than them? Who said your worth could be measured in numbers, titles, or applause? Who convinced you that if your life didn't look like theirs, you were failing? And more importantly, why are you still believing them? Because the truth is, you were never meant to live this way. The mind trap of modern life isn't natural, it's engineered. And the moment you see the strings, you can stop being the puppet. Unplug, not forever, not dramatically, but enough to remember the feel of your own breath, the warmth of sunlight through a window, the sound of your heartbeat in the quiet. Comparison loses its grip when you come home to yourself, when you touch the raw, unedited now. And you'll find, as countless meditators have before you, that in this simple, unfiltered presence, there's no one to compare to, no race to run, no prize to win, just this breath, this moment. And an ancient, quiet enoughness you forgot was yours. So if the modern world built the trap, your awareness is the key. Notice the patterns, name the game, and then slowly step away. Because something far more real is waiting for you beyond the noise. And perhaps you're curious, if we leave behind this endless mind trap, what does a life of freedom, presence, and authentic connection actually feel like? That's what we'll uncover next, and it may be simpler and more beautiful than you ever imagined. There's a beautiful truth in this life. You are not trapped. No matter how deep the patterns of comparison run, no matter how loud the voice of not enough has become, there is a path out. A way to unhook yourself from the endless measuring and remember the peace that was always yours. But here's the thing. Freedom isn't about winning. It isn't about finally becoming the best version of yourself or gathering enough praise to drown out your insecurities. It's about shifting the lens, changing the way you see yourself and the world around you. And ancient wisdom offers us 3 simple, powerful tools: mudita, gratitude, and mindfulness. Let's begin with mudita, a word few in the modern world know, yet one of the most liberating emotions you could ever cultivate. In Pali, mudita means sympathetic joy, the ability to feel genuine happiness for someone else's success, without envy, without bitterness, without the silent wish that it was you instead. It might sound impossible in a culture built on rivalry, but mudita isn't a naive cheerfulness. It's a radical act of freedom, because when you can truly celebrate another's good fortune, you dissolve the illusion that their light dims your own. You recognize that happiness isn't a limited resource, that their joy takes nothing away from yours. And in that moment, you step off the battleground. Then comes gratitude, not the performative kind you post about, not the list you hurriedly write before bed, hoping it'll fix your restless heart, but a deeper, quieter gratitude, the kind that wakes up inside you when you truly see what you've been given: your breath, the warmth of sunlight on your face, the fact that you've survived every hard thing life has thrown at you so far. Gratitude isn't about pretending everything's perfect. It's about remembering in the midst of your struggles that this life, with all its flaws and fragility, is still astonishingly beautiful. And when you're grateful, something shifts. Comparison loses its edge, because you're no longer fixated on what's missing. You're awake to what's already here. And finally, the most ancient and powerful tool of all, mindfulness, not as a trendy app, not as a quick fix for stress, but as a living, breathing practice, a way of inhabiting your own life moment by moment without judgment. When you're mindful, you notice the comparison thoughts rising, and instead of following them, you simply watch. There's that voice again telling me I'm behind. There's that tightness in my chest when I see their success. And in noticing, you create space. Space between the thought and the self, between the old pattern and the choice. This is where freedom lives. As the Buddha once taught, in seeing there is only seeing, in hearing only hearing, in thinking only thinking. No need to cling, no need to push away. No need to turn every passing thought into a story about your worth. The mind will compare. It's what it's built to do, but you don't have to be enslaved by it. You can learn to witness your mind like you'd watch clouds drift across the sky. No cloud stays forever, no storm lasts, and slowly, gently, you return to the only place peace has ever lived, the present moment. This is the way out, not through force, not through suppression, but through radical presence. Through mudita, you untangle envy. Through gratitude, you soften the craving for more. Through mindfulness, you become the witness, not the prisoner. And here's a secret you'll begin to discover along the way. When you stop comparing, you don't just find peace, you find connection. You realize that beneath all our roles, all our numbers and polished profiles, every human heart beats with the same longing, to be seen, to be enough, to come home to itself. And in dropping the comparisons, you create space to actually love this life. As it is, as you are. There's still more to this journey, because while these tools are ancient, integrating them into modern life takes practice, patience, and a deep understanding of how our habits work. So next, let's explore how to actually break the old loops and embody this wisdom in everyday moments, where the real work and the quiet miracles begin. There's a question that lingers in the silence after all the noise fades. If not with others, then with whom should I compare myself? It's a question our restless minds love to ask, because the comparing mind doesn't just disappear when we understand its traps. It wants a target, a benchmark, a way to measure worth. And here's where Buddhist wisdom offers a tender, radical invitation. Compare only with yourself, but not the self you've constructed through ego, roles, or titles. The deeper self, the one beyond illusions. The Buddha often spoke of the path, not as a competition, not as a race, but as a personal, intimate journey inward. A journey where the only measure is whether you are a little less burdened by craving today than you were yesterday, a little kinder, a little more awake. In one of the ancient sutras, a disciple once asked the Buddha, "Master, who is the greatest among us?" And the Buddha smiled, "The one who has conquered himself, not the one with the most followers, not the one who speaks the loudest or sits the highest, but the one who quietly, patiently, turns inward and untangles the knots of delusion and attachment within." This is the path of self-liberation, and it begins with a different kind of comparison. Not, am I better than them, but am I freer than I was yesterday? Not, do I have more, but do I cling less? Not, am I admired, but am I at peace? This inward comparison isn't about harsh self-judgment. It's about awareness. It's about noticing where you still hold tightly, where you still get pulled into old habits of envy, of neediness, of fear. And then, without shame, simply letting go. Each moment becomes a mirror, each reaction an invitation. You learn to ask, what does this reveal about me? What is it teaching me about where I'm stuck, where I'm free, where I'm still chasing shadows? And slowly, so slowly you might not notice at first, your focus shifts. From the outer stage of other people's stories, back to the quiet work of tending your own heart. This is where the real progress happens. Not in grand, dramatic leaps, but in the humble, unseen victories. The moment you notice a jealous thought, and instead of believing it, you smile. The day you witness someone else's success and genuinely feel glad for them. The evening you catch yourself craving praise and remember it won't fill the ache you're carrying. The Buddha called this process bhavana, the cultivation of the heart-mind. It's gardening work, pulling the weeds of greed, hatred, and delusion, watering the seeds of joy, peace, and compassion, and it's lifelong. The mistake most seekers make is believing enlightenment is a moment, a lightning bolt, a single perfect insight, but it isn't, it's this exact moment. The choice to turn inward, again and again, no matter how many times you forget. And every time you do, you loosen one more thread from the net of comparison. You realize you don't need to be anyone but who you are on this day, in this breath. And here's the unexpected beauty. When you stop comparing yourself to others, and even soften the grip of comparing yourself to your past or future selves, what's left is presence, a state where you simply are, not behind, not ahead. Not better, not worse, just here. And in that here-ness, the very thing you've been chasing, peace, worth, belonging, quietly arrives, not as a trophy, but as your natural state. You begin to see others not as rivals or reminders of what you lack, but as fellow travelers, each carrying invisible burdens, each longing to be free. And you walk beside them, not ahead, not behind, but shoulder to shoulder, a little lighter, a little clearer, a little more awake. And now, with this wisdom settling into your bones, there's only one thing left to do: step into the final chapter, where all these threads, the battles within, the hidden costs, the ancient traps, and the timeless tools weave together into one simple, radiant truth. A truth about coming home to yourself. And so we arrive here, at the edge of all questions, beyond the tangle of needing to be more, to have more, to outshine or outpace. A place where the noise of the world quiets and a deeper voice, the one you forgot you had, begins to whisper. Who would you be if you no longer needed to compare yourself to anyone? Not better, not worse, not ahead, not behind, simply you, not the fragile identity built from likes, titles, or possessions, but the boundless awareness beneath all that, the self untouched by praise or blame, the self that neither rises nor falls. In Buddhist thought, there's a word for this, Tathagata, one who has gone beyond, one who moves through the world without clinging, without resisting, without needing to prove or perform. A being so at ease within themselves that comparison no longer makes sense. Because when you truly see your nature, you realize there's nothing to compare. The leaf doesn't envy the mountain. The river isn't threatened by the sky. The sun doesn't compete with the stars. Each is complete in itself, and so are you. The ancient masters said, when you realize your own true nature, the whole universe belongs to you, not in the sense of ownership, but in belonging, in intimacy. You stop being a stranger to yourself. You stop measuring your worth against moving targets. You stop chasing illusions, and instead you live, fully, presently, unapologetically. You begin to see how limitless you truly are, not limitless in acquiring but in being. Not in what you can consume or conquer, but in what you can embody, peace, compassion, joy, presence. And as that realization settles, the world softens too. You notice how people are no longer competitors but mirrors. Every interaction, a reflection of some part of yourself still seeking, still yearning, still waking up. And you meet them not with envy, not with judgment, but with tenderness, because you've tasted freedom. And once you've tasted it, you'll never settle for chains again. The beauty is, you don't need to wait, you don't need to become perfect, you don't need to reach some distant peak. Freedom is here, now, in this breath. It arrives the moment you drop the weight of comparison and step into the fullness of who you already are. A vast, open, spacious awareness. A limitless self, unbound by labels, untouched by praise or criticism. The still, clear sky behind every passing cloud. And from this place, everything changes. Not because the world outside is different, but because your gaze has softened, your grasping has loosened, your heart has opened. So as this journey closes, remember, you were never meant to be someone else. You were meant to be you. And when you live from that place, without needing to compare, without chasing someone else's shadow, you become unstoppable, untouchable, unbound. Because a limitless self cannot be measured, it can only be lived. This is your true nature. This is home. And now, walk on. If these words found a quiet place in your heart, if for a moment you felt yourself returning home to something deeper, then this journey doesn't have to end here. At Zen Buddhism Wisdom, we walk these ancient paths together, exploring not just teachings, but the inner landscapes we've forgotten how to see. So if you'd like to keep walking with us, if you'd like to hear more stories, more wisdom, and find gentle reminders in the noise of modern life, I invite you to subscribe, not as a number, not as a follower, but as a fellow traveler. And if you know someone, a friend, a loved one, or even a stranger you sense is carrying too much, share this with them. Because sometimes, the right words at the right moment can ease a lifetime's burden. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And until we meet again, may you be well, may you be peaceful, and may you remember, your true self is limitless.